You found the Rube Goldberg Machine of Semiotics and Symbols podcast. RGMS is an artist collective and independent research journal engaging in experimental music works ranging from lush soundscapes to near barren field recordings, and controlled chaos to meditative canopies. Since late 2020, RGMS has released a wide variety of both albums and research publications. Find them on the website at r-g-m-s.com. Today, Sean, Kiley and Iminah Kani will be discussing the research publication The Way of Dionysus and Apollo in the RGMS, which explores the role of mythology in the collective. For a link to the publication, see the show notes. Also in the show notes is the RGMS Patreon support link. If you'd like access to exclusive content, join there and consider supporting RGMS to make more podcasts like this possible for the future. Thanks for listening in.
In the black between the stars, in the black center of your eyes, where eternity is remembering to start, where infinity lost count of itself, where the void forgot to become, where the light hides its heart, the brink collides with the apex on the invisible lips of the dark, and breathes being into transfixed space, sending bursting light apart into the color of what time is, into the color of your iris. The track you just heard was Moss Number 1 on the Invisible Lips of the Dark from the album Meditation Objects, Supplements, and Sequences, Volume 1. Today I'm joined by flamenco guitarist and composer Iminah Kani. She has taken on physical form to aid us in our quest of unraveling the mythos of the RGMS and beyond. We'll be discussing The Way of Dionysus and Apollo in the RGMS, a research publication penned in early 2021, which serves as the foundation of understanding the transpersonal and symbolic nature of music explored in the RGMS. By examining ancient myths dialectically, we will set the stage for the realization of music as the dialectical synthesis, which is discussed in the forthcoming episode. Here, in this symbolic realm, we begin to elucidate the musical engagement that participates with ineffable meaning in hopes to unearth an experience that is all the more enlightening and fulfilling. So essentially what we'll be doing is preparing the ground for the experience of understanding and engaging with the inherent qualities of art. And by inherent qualities, we are referring to those collective and more universally oriented forces which underlie and guide both the process of completion and the reception of a work of art, or specifically music in the case of the RGMS. And the phenomenon we'll be focusing in on is that wherein one form of an energy or characteristic approach inherent to the art may be consciously or unconsciously overshadowing its opposite energetic equivalent and therefore be out of balance.
Right, so the way that we're going to go about doing this is by diving into mythology.
Yes, because mythology, more than anything else, makes use of and explores the most distilled or collectivized forms of these energies which pervade the arts, not only in the work itself, but also in the experience and the engagement with it. All right, so before we dive into the depths of myth, I think we ought to cover conceptually some language or perhaps the metaphysics operative in much of these ideas. And that's not to say that these concepts are de facto reality, but they're rather employed to help us cultivate a deeper understanding of something which is inarticulatable and eludes our everyday understanding.
Yeah, so maybe we should start by diving into the diagrams that are included in the Way of Dionysus and Apollo in the RGMS essay.
Yes, so essentially, the metaphysics, or those most essential foundational principles which give rise to the lens or the framework through which we are examining these myths, include the distinction between the idea of the transcendent realm and the imminent realm. And that's imminent with an A, not as in imminent as about to happen. So the transcendent realm, which can also be called the noumenal realm, is the idea of the limitless, where infinity resides. It's above the range of normal physical human experience. It's beyond comprehension, and it's beyond time or space. Whereas the immanent, which is sometimes also called the phenomenal, is the place of form. It's the indwelling of the transcendent, the realm of possibility, of experience and knowledge, and where time and space exist. So, what we have then is this concept of the essence and the energy distinction. And the essence is a singular, incomprehensible force, which usually resides in the transcendent, but radiates many seemingly different energies in the immanent.
So, for an example of the essence, if we take like the sun is one essence, but within the sun, it radiates multiple different things, different energy, right? So you get heat and light, which can be experienced.
Yes, and more abstractly, in Christianity, we have the concept of the Trinity.
Mm.
And the Trinity is the three distinct energies of the one God, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, what we want to emphasize is the understanding of these energies in the immanent realm, which produce archetypes. The archetype is the thing which acts as an indicator of that which is transcendent. It's the closest representation of the transcendent that we have. It allows us to begin to express unfathomable forces because remember, the transcendent is above the range of normal physical human experience.
Mm.
And so archetypes give it a semblance of form because we need form to understand the formless.
Right. Okay. So to word it a little bit differently, then energies can be understood as archetypes.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And these energies can be conceived of as portals into the transcendent realm.
Mm.
So, furthermore, there are different levels of archetypes. You can think of the interrelation among archetypes as a pyramid.
Hmm.
At the top, you have the one or the transcendent principle, which we can't necessarily engage with directly since it's the embodiment of the ineffable. Then below the capstone, we have two stones, which are representative of the dual. And here you have the binary energies, for example, the principle of the positive and the negative. Then below that, we have the three, which manifest an idea such as the Trinity, followed by the four, wherein we get the four cardinal directions or elements of nature, fire, air, water, earth.
Mm. Okay. And then we have like other archetypes, right? Like let's say in astrology, there's the 12 zodiac signs. Those are all different archetypes.
Yes, those are still archetypes, just further down the pyramid, so to speak. Therefore, technically less archetypal and less collective, but still very much collective in the grand scheme of things.
Mm.
I mean, you can think of that which is more archetypal as being more collective, insofar as more people will fit into one of the dualistic categories than they would into one of the zodiacal archetypes, to say the sign of Aquarius. Now, in terms of those most archetypal energies, which manifest as the dual on the archetypal pyramid, each half of these dual immanent archetypes can be referred to by many names, but ultimately, all these names represent the same aspect of the transcendent force we experience in the material, right? Many energies, one essence. So in the RGMS, we're working within the dualistic framework of the conscious and the unconscious dialectic. So the unconscious can also be referred to as the yin of the yin yang in Chinese culture, or the lunar principles in alchemy, or Dionysus in Greek mythology, or the energy of soul in psychology. They're the many names for the same transcendent thing, and they are one pole which we experience.
Mm.
Its opposite pole is the conscious pole, which is also the yang of the yin yang, the solar principles, Apollo in Greek mythology, and spirit in psychology. So the essence of the transcendent manifests into energetic opposites on this dualistic plane. The opposite forces are of a similar origin, but merely polarly valenced manifestations of the singular energy. So it's similar with like electrical energy. We have negative and positively charged poles, but they're both of the same source energy, which is electricity. So the RGMS ostensibly seeks to bring these opposing forces into balance, because when one overshadows the other, there's an imbalance or a disharmony. And just as with electricity, both poles must be functional and balanced in order for the current to flow. The more balanced the poles are, the more efficient the flow. And so, just as we bring music into harmony, we also harmonize the totality of being, because the universe tends towards equilibrium. But the individual also has the power to bring equilibrium down from the higher planes into the lower. And this is dialectical tension. There's a thesis which births an antithesis that must be reunited with its opposite by way of synthesis.
Yeah, okay. So, how do we start to dive into that?
Yeah, so I think to understand how to balance or integrate these opposing polar archetypal forces, an understanding of mythology is essential, because mythology is the language of the transcendent, because it's an archetypal language. It's where the laws of space and time no longer function.
Yeah, okay. So, myth is where, like, the archetypes live. Myth is born, let's say, through these archetypal energies. This is how the myths come to fruition.
Yeah, and it's that realm where you can, see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold eternity in the palm of your hand and infinity in an hour, to quote William Blake.
Yeah, nice, Blake. Yeah, so the myths are not literal. They always are, but never were.
Yeah, always are, but never were, because they don't exist in space-time. They're eternal, but they never actually existed.
And then to quote James Hillman, there is no original story. There are always countless versions of the same myth. It is not an explanation. The word explain means to lay out flat. So these myths may deepen, tantalize, confuse, provoke, but their purpose is not merely to explain.
Right, and the rational mind, specifically the Western rational mind, may have some issues with this ability to conceive the usefulness of something which doesn't explain, or something which resists narrative. But we'll get into this in more detail later on. So, to fully grasp the immanent representations of the transcendent, we have to locate them mythologically, because the myth acts as a compass to show us whether we are caught in the unbalanced or pathological form of the energies. And for this, Greek tragedy is the most pertinent, because the tragedy relayed is not necessarily one of material suffering. Well, there is much suffering in these tragedies, but it's more about the tragedy of being caught in the unbalanced energy, which gives rise to the suffering. So we'll be looking at these myths more didactically, examining the tragic figure as one who is ostensibly caught in the myth.
And Hillman also says that we do not read myth to correct it. We read a myth to learn what it tells us about psychic figuring and how the psyche figures out patterns of life.
Right. Yeah, because the myth puts on display the interaction of archetypal energies. And the drama or the tragedy creates patterns. And we're able to see those patterns of life, how they configurate and give rise to the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the traditional sort of role of the shaman. The shaman is the one who is able to see the patterns underlying reality. And you have this in, like, psychedelic experiences too. Like, you see that which is, like, hidden to normal everyday empirical sensibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to start, we should look at the tragedy of conscious energy, which is also associated with the energy of spirit, Apollo, Yang, solar principles. And one of the best examples of this is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. But firstly, we should discuss what the archetypal character of conscious energy is.
Yeah, when I think about conscious energy, I think about, reason, literalism, science, abstraction, the left brain, sort of
Mhm.
immediacy.
Right. I like the image of, like, the column of fire. It's a very vertical sort of approach. It tries to override time and space, and it kind of acts as like a medium of translation. Tries to translate the noumenal thing into the phenomenal.
Mm.
And I also think it's comparable to the Vedic Jnana Yoga, which is the intellectual way of knowing God.
Right, that's an important word, the intellect.
Yes, right. Left brain,
Mm-hmm.
critical thinking.
Yeah, this would maybe also be just like our typical day self, like going about our days, doing everything. It's very like conscious energy.
Yes, very much so. It's, ego, the thing which is claims to be in control. So yeah, Oedipus Rex, the tragedy of the energy of conscious. So I'll go through this in detail because the tragedy of Oedipus is often misread or misunderstood through the lens of Freud, and it's quite enlightening to see how the drama itself actually plays out.
Yeah, and as far as this myth goes, like probably what most people have heard about Oedipus is just through, the Oedipus complex and Freud discussing that, that complex is that you want to sleep, like,
Yeah.
let's say, so if you're a boy with your mother or as a girl with your father, and it just seems so absurd, even though, Freud still did some admirable things in psychology.
Yeah. Anyway, so the setting of this Greek drama is in Thebes. And Thebes at this time is a city which worships the god of Apollo. So it starts with the king of Thebes, Laios, and his wife, the queen Jocasta. And they visit the oracle at Delphi, which is the temple of the god Apollo, which is the god that the city of Thebes worships. So the oracle tells them that if they bear a son, their son will kill his father, the king Laios. And the king and the queen, they take this and they're sort of shaken by this. So much so that when their son is born, out of fear of the oracle coming true, Jocasta and Laios give Oedipus away. Well, actually, they intend to leave him to die on Mount Cathaeron, but a shepherd ends up bringing him Oedipus to the city of Corinth. And there he becomes the adopted son of the king of Corinth, Polybus. So Oedipus grows up not knowing that he's adopted. And then one day at a tavern, a man drunkenly calls him a bastard. And Oedipus realizes that he's not being perceived as he thinks he is. And this makes him decide to leave Corinth. And so he heads out towards the neighboring city of Thebes. And on his way there, he encounters a small company traveling to the Oracle at Delphi. And they meet at a place where the three roads cross, and a fight actually ensues as to who has the right of way. So this fight escalates when the charioteer of the company Oedipus has encountered tries to run Oedipus over, and then Oedipus ends up killing nearly the whole company except for one. So it turns out that this group of people is actually Laios and his servants. So here Oedipus has unbeknowingly killed his own father, fulfilling the oracle at Delphi. So then Oedipus arrives at Thebes and he encounters a sphinx who would not let anyone pass unless they could answer his riddle. And Oedipus answers it correctly, and it's a very silly riddle.
Yes, as they should be.
And by virtue of this, he gains right of passage and rids the city of Thebes of the Sphinx, because the Sphinx was terrorizing the city. So much so that the brother of the newly widowed Jocasta, Creon, had declared that anyone who could rid the city of the Sphinx would be declared king. So Oedipus enters the city of Thebes, is declared king, and unknowingly marries his birth mother, Jocasta.
Wow.
And yeah, time goes on. Neither of them have any idea of their situation. They have 4 children together, 2 sons, 2 daughters, until one day a plague of infertility besets the city. And Oedipus sends his brother-in-law Creon to the oracle at Delphi. And Creon returns saying that in order for the city of Thebes to be cured, the murderer of Laios must be found and cast out from the city. So Oedipus takes this to heart, takes it literally, and he conducts an investigation. But his wife/mother, the queen Jocasta, has a very bad intuition about the investigation and begs Oedipus to cease his search for the murderer. But Oedipus persists, and he ends up finding out that he, in fact, is the murderer of his father, the king Laios, which was in fulfillment of the oracle at Delphi's original prophecy. So the majority of the play is Oedipus conducting this investigation and coming to this realization. And before he can accept it, Jocasta realizes it and she hangs herself. And then upon finding his dead wife/mother, Oedipus gouges his eyes out with one of her hairpins and then is exiled from the city.
That's intense.
Yeah. So yeah, examined archetypally, the tragedy of this myth is one of literalism, the unbalanced energy of conscious. Because by Laios and Jocasta literally interpreting the myth of the oracle at Delphi and actively trying to avoid it, they have ultimately caused it to come true.
Yeah. Right. So Hillman says taking action to avoid the prophecy fulfills the prophecy.
Mm.
So the doom is not in the prophecy. It's in the action taken when one takes the oracle literally. Right. Because prophecy is a forthtelling, stating like what is archetypally present as a dark potential and which may become acted in the day world and time. So only then does forthtelling become foretelling. Because the word prophecy actually means telling forth, like saying it like it is, not saying it as it will be.
Yeah.
So this myth is that example of this unbalanced conscious or Apollonian energy, right? These principles, these Apollonian principles that are unable to see the symbolic nature of the oracle, right? Because taking it literally is unable to understand it symbolically.
Right. Yeah. And the city of Thebes literally worships the god of Apollo.
Mm.
And it's, trying to always find out rationally, understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it only wants the rational cipheric understanding of it, as we've talked, like the difference between the cipher and the symbol, right? Something that's exacting.
Right.
that literalist interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could say that like literalism is really like the decline of imagination, right? A lack of soul.
Yeah, the symbol requires imagination to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it beckons imagination,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the cipher gives it to you.
Right.
The only thing it asks you to do is take it as it is. Alright, so the real tragedy of the city of Thebes is that having already been caught in this tragic archetype of Apollo, which is literalism, right? Which is manifested through taking the original oracle at Delphi, literally. Oedipus then employs a method to try and resolve the suffering that is of the same energy which got Thebes and himself into this predicament in the first place. He again consults the oracle at Delphi, interpreting the message of the oracle literally, conducting an investigation, right? Investigation is a very conscious energy, an investigation to cast out the murder of Laios, thus succumbs to that pathology of conscious energy, which must know at all costs, even if it means his own demise, which it ultimately almost does.
Mm-hmm.
So the message of this myth is that one can't solve a problem by way of the thing that caused the problem itself. We have to look outside of the thing which gave rise to our suffering, consort its opposite to show us how to bring us back into a state of balance or a state of harmony. So the answer to the unbalance of literalism, of taking the oracle at Delphi literally, is not, again, going back to the oracle at Delphi and taking it literally.
Right.
It creates a feedback loop
Mm-hmm.
of pathology,
Mm-hmm.
and suffering can be conceived of as nothing but the outpouring of pathology from psyche.
Mm-hmm.
It needs a place to go, to burst forth when the energy gets too unbalanced.
Right. So like that pathology of this myth permeates all parts of life.
Yes. And even in those like moments of what we call genius, right? The realization doesn't come by examining the question at hand under a microscope. You know, we can try to crack the code with an immeasurable amount of rigor to no avail, but we might succumb to a certain like frame paralysis. And this is something which occurs on an emotional level quite often, where we get so lost in a feeling such as melancholy that we can't imagine what it feels like to view the world from a perspective of joy. So we miss the whole of experience. So, yeah, these moments of genius are really like those in which we can see from the whole of experience, from the realm of the transcendent, beyond the senses, beyond comprehension. So, through our rigor, we may have realizations, but that moment of true insight, of inspired genius, really only comes when we turn away from the thing itself in question and when we try to put it out of our minds or consult its opposite. We align our minds with the natural order of the cosmos and are struck by a realization from the realm of the transcendent, suddenly rendering the question transparent.
Mm.
Sort of a shifting of our lens to see the matter in the whole of experience rather than through the narrow slit of the microscope. It's a true gestalt, a glimpse into the nature of God.
Mm-hmm. Right. So trying to force genius through looking at the question under a microscope is this sort of spirit pathology of literalism, which we see manifested through the concept of like a textbook.
Right.
As soon as you have a textbook, you're in the realm of spirit because no matter what field you're dealing with, if it's art therapy or, even astrology,
Yeah.
you've totally left the realm of soul and the unconscious because you're literally trying to find these like perfect little, descriptions and everything becomes static once you have a textbook,
Mm.
right? And this staticizing of things is a very spirit pathology.
Mhm.
Like in psychology, they have the DSM, which is the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders textbook, right? And like every year it just grows because people keep psychologists keep creating more and more, typologies pretty much of disease and things like this.
Right. More and more case studies.
Yeah.
And creates, further distinctions rather than seeing the whole.
Exactly. It's not seeing the collective connection, it's isolating everything, right? And that's what labeling does. It sort of isolates and staticizes people into being one thing, or
Right.
the collectivity sort of gets lost.
Yeah, you almost realize that, like, as it gets bigger and bigger, like, no two cases are even actually the same. And so the disease ultimately is actually only specific to the individual. So the process of characterizing the individual diseases is a futile exercise because it's the individual that has to be focused on. So, if you come at an individual with a textbook saying that, oh, you might have this disease, it's like, no, that's another individual like that had that disorder.
Mm-hmm.
This individual is something different, something nuanced.
Right, yeah, exactly. In which Carl Jung, advocated for treating a patient with this method, a lot more.
Yes.
This was very important to him, which, yeah, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and this is kind of the irony of soul, because soul sort of implies collective energy, but here it's manifesting individually. So it's sort of functioning as the panacea to the spirit pathology, which manifests as identity or categorization or labels.
Mm-hmm.
And so the soul response into that is to resist labels
Mm-hmm.
and focus more on just the individual, like the whole psyche of the individual.
Yeah.
And we very much have a culture that's obsessed with labels and identity,
Mm-hmm.
partially because people who are easier to label or identify are easier to sell things to.
Yeah.
So we have a barrage of advertising, which is reinforcing these label, identity, categorical ways of perceiving the self and others.
Yeah, totally. But then bringing it back, to the myth of Oedipus,
Mhm.
what would be this sort of counter interpretation of the oracle at Delphi given to Laius and Jocasta?
Right. So if we try to interpret the oracle symbolically, as it should be, right? Symbolically interpret it, therefore not succumbing to the pathology of conscious. Essentially, what we have is the archetype of the son killing the father. And this is mythologically represented in the recurring stories of the old gods dying to make way for the new gods, such as Zeus, the god of the Greeks, killing his father Cronus to become the king of the gods.
Mm, right, we see that sort of dichotomy of puer and senex. Right, puer being that young, youthful energy, young man, let's say, and then senex being, old man, it's like Kronos in that example.
Right, the young man is always trying to overthrow the old man
Mm-hmm.
intrapsychically, but also, we have this in politics as well, right? So is the younger generation trying to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So mythologically interpreted, like for the city of Thebes, the old god, which is Apollo, right? They worship Apollo. This worship of Apollo must be replaced by a new god, perhaps the worship of Apollo's opposite, Dionysus.
Right. So the point there being to come at it with a soul perspective.
Right.
Or not really perspective, but method. Soul method.
Yes. Perspective too, because it's how you examine the issue, how you examine the problem.
Mm.
Not only how you interpret it and how you act upon it, but yeah, it's all of these things. So what's so interesting is that this has to be done though in a balance,
Mm.
because if we look now into the tragedy of the unconscious energy or the energy of soul, Dionysus, yin, lunar principles, we'll see how by engaging too much in soul in an imbalance also results in tragedy. And this is best exemplified by the play The Bacchae by Euripides. So before we get into that, we should go over the characteristics of the archetype of the unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the unconscious can be seen as, well, soul, right? Intuition,
Mhm.
paradox, right? Brain,
Yeah, the right brain is like associated, with chaos, magic, intoxication, paradox, sort of pure empiricism.
Mm-hmm. And also the soul is time, really, something which is rooted in time, just like the pagan cosmologies, right? Everything being based off the seasons, measuring time with the sun and moon. It's much more rooted in nature, observing as things sort of progress horizontally, right?
It's patient
Mm-hmm.
and labyrinthine, takes the long route rather than the immediacy of spirit, right?
Right, that's that difference between spirit being vertical and soul being horizontal.
hmm
It's nice to visualize it that way.
Yeah, and for posterity, yeah, if we compare it to a Vedic yoga, the karmic yoga is most exemplary of soul. Karmic yoga being a sort of Taoist mentality, a doing, not doing, acting without having expectations, right? You don't expect to have an insight from the symbol when you act upon it in a soul manner. It's kind of like having faith in the image or the myth or whatever symbolic content. Yeah, you sort of linger in the symbolic realm as opposed to trying to translate the image in the mode of the more cypheric spirit energy, which ultimately leads to more dogmatic thinking.
Mm-hmm. Right. Religion is more of the spirit, and let's say esotericism is the soul.
Right. Yes, but you need a balance of the exoteric and the esoteric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Really, the soul method is letting the image do the work on your psyche, sitting in the image, right? It's going to do the work on you by virtue of the fact that you're there with it,
Yeah.
seeping into the image, not trying to squash it into a sort of into meaning.
Yeah. Right. Not trying to articulate a meaning right away. So not only does it work on you by virtue of you being there with the symbol, but also the very practice of examining or attempting to decipher without necessarily reaching conclusions or applying meaning to the symbol, and generally using your mind to try and understand it. This is itself the very process of understanding.
Mm.
And you can think that, like, with symbols, contentment yields understanding rather than understanding yielding contentment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here contentment does not inherently mean that like the image feels great.
Yes,
Like sometimes the image is terrible.
right.
Rather, it's the act of feeling a response from the image. That's what's important, right? Because a good example are like nightmares. Like most people remember a nightmare, but they don't remember like some dream that they had. And they were just like eating chips on a couch and they felt great.
Yeah, they're the images that we recoil from most strongly, and those are always the most important ones.
Mm-hmm.
And they sort of beckon meditation.
Mm,
So the engagement is more, yeah, karmic yoga. It's not overwhelmed by the emotional content of the image where you recoil in a sort of traumatic response, but rather you sort of try to engage with it in a less charged state.
yeah.
Yeah, with nightmares, like the reason that we have nightmares is because, our dreams are trying to tell us something. They're trying to get through to us.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way they know how to get through to us to shock us, right? And this suggests like there's, an underlying intelligence.
Right. Just like how Pierre Grime calls it, like the dream master, which is great. I love that. We can think about our dreams having a dream master.
Yeah.
And he kind of puts it, well, I'll quote Pierre Grimes here. He says, in dreams, if there is a repeating order, then a pattern is present. If there is a pattern, then it is either static or dynamic. If the pattern is dynamic, then there is a theme. If the themes present are unified, then they are intelligent and therefore meaningful. If they are meaningful, they are thus a benefit. The meaningful through which benefit may be derived is the essence of the Greek notion of art.
Yeah, and in the RGMS, what we're getting at is that you can find the same intelligence at play in a work of art.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's do the Bakke,
Yeah.
the pathology of unconscious, soul, Dionysus, yin, lunar principles.
Mm-hmm.
So the setting for this play, ironically, is again Thebes. Same city, different time. And before we get into this, we might, interpret this through the lens of the hermetic swing of the pendulum, wherein a swing of the pendulum to the left equals a swing of the pendulum to the right. So for the city of Thebes, having succumbed to the pathology of Apollo, swinging far to the left with the energy of conscious, so much so it becomes pathological. Now, sometime after, swings to that same extent to the right into that murky realm of unconscious pathological energy.
Mm.
So yeah, the main character in this play is Dionysus himself. And Dionysus is the son of Selim, who is a member of the royal family of Thebes. And his father is Zeus, king of the Olympians, which makes Dionysus a god man. And after giving birth to Dionysus, Selim is killed by Zeus's jealous wife Hera.
Damn.
But Selim's family refuses to believe that she had given birth to the son of Zeus, and she's cast out, sort of I don't know, a quack.
Yes, she was a duck.
Yeah, but yeah, like in the story of Castor and Pollux. I mean, Zeus turns into, oh, not a duck, but a swan.
Right, yeah. It's possible.
Anyway, so Dionysus is in Thebes, and he's disturbed to learn that the people of the city don't believe that his mother Selim gave birth to a god, and neither does his family. And Selim's sisters Autoni and Agave. Agave is actually the mother of the king Pentheus. They don't believe Selim. So Dionysus plans to vindicate his mother by appearing before the city of Thebes as a god. And to do this, he first disguises himself as a mortal, not immortal. And he drives the women of the city mad, including his aunts, Agave and Autone. Autono? I don't know how to say her name. They they retreat to Mount Cathiron to engage in ritual festivities. And the women possessed by Dionysus dance and sing odes in praise of Dionysus, not knowing that he's actually there. And the king, Pentheus, the son of Agave, gets word of this and finds out that his mother and his aunt and his grandfather, Cadmus, have been swept up by the festivities. So Pentheus sees, Dionysus, who's sort of initiating this and condemns him. Doesn't know who he is because Dionysus is disguised. And Pentheus intends to have Dionysus stoned to death. And Dionysus is imprisoned, but he easily breaks out, destroying the prison because he's a god. After he does this, the women's behavior, who are possessed by Dionysus, becomes increasingly more intense and strange. They start to rip cattle to shreds with their own hands and twine snakes in their hair, like performing miraculous feats.
Wow.
So Dionysus, still in disguise, convinces Pentheus that the king should disguise himself as a female Maenad to spy on the possessed women in the mountains, and then arrange an armed attack. So Pentheus agrees, and then Dionysus leads him out into the mountain. And as he's leading him out, the king is actually becoming more and more possessed by, Dionysus. And then on Mount Kithairon, with the aid of Dionysus, Pentheus climbs a tree to spy on the possessed women below. And then Dionysus reveals himself to the women as a god and points out the disguised Pentheus in the tree. And yeah, seeing a man in the tree drives the Maenads wild. And so, led by his mother Agave, Pentheus is trapped, brought down from the tree, and ripped limb from limb.
So brutal.
Yeah. So, even worse, still possessed by the god Dionysus, Agave returns to the city of Thebes, parading the decapitated head of her son, Pentheus, around like a trophy because she believes it to be the head of a mountain lion in her delirious state. And she presents the head to her father, the former king of Thebes, Cadmus, who recoils in disgust. And Agave is confused as to why her father does not delight in her trophy. So then she calls out for Pentheus, her son, so that Pentheus would mount the head on her door for all to see. But yeah, her madness begins to wane, and Cadmus forces her to realize what she's done.
Wow.
So the tragedy, this is the tragedy of the unconscious, the pathology of soul. It's the energy which envelops the totality of the individual, casting them completely out of the realm of the phenomenal and into the realm of madness.
Mm.
It's intoxication and chaos, completely unbalanced.
Right. So like crazy Agave, who is like so possessed by the energy of soul, becomes completely detached from reality. She is like
Yes.
overcome by, let's say, the collective unconscious, which she has allowed to like inundate her psyche. And that's that danger of the ego death, right? That we sort of sometimes like naively wish upon ourselves.
Yes, especially in the West.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you have Pentheus, on the other hand, who harbors this sort of skepticism of the power of the unconscious, which is, depicted in his whole family's skepticism of the godhood of Dionysus, right? Not believing Selim, that the father of Dionysus is Zeus. And this skepticism is the thing which brings about his demise, because he's unable to realize the power of the thing which he rejects.
Mm.
And it's the same skepticism in the West of the qualities of soul, those occult forces. And because of this skepticism, these are the things that ultimately rip us apart, dismember us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so similarly, like in the theology of Christianity, which casts a great shadow over the psyche of the West, we have this theological doctrine of the privatio bonum, which conceives of evil as nothing but a degradation of the good.
Mm.
And we can sort of think of this as not giving evil its due. We metaphysically delegitimize its sway over us, just as Pentheus does with his skepticism of the godhood of Dionysus.
Mm.
And it tragically allows for the evil to display its full power over us.
Mm-hmm.
So, therefore, we have to grant due power not only to evil, but also to our environments, because all pathology is tied in with the environment, especially as we see with the city of Thebes, right? The environment in which these two great tragedies take place.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, environment has a huge aesthetic importance,
Hmm.
and it's just always wanting more beauty, right? Like the environment resonates accordingly with its aesthetic value. And I think myths are meant to function in an aesthetic environment.
Mm.
And it seems like there's sort of been a degradation of that. Like now with aesthetics in the environment, like even with like architecture, let's say, that seems to be the last thing that's considered is like the beauty of the building. It's all about efficiency and how many people can we squash into this building in this much space? And it's very boxy and
Yeah.
it seems to be lacking soul almost completely because it's just utilitarian.
Hmm.
Right. So then I think because the environment starts to lack that aesthetic value, we start to disassociate from the environment that we're living in.
Mm.
I mean, let's say maybe in a very suburban or city landscape, which maybe doesn't have, no, there wasn't much aesthetic importance put into it.
Yeah.
So we start to disassociate from that environment because let's say it's just not beautiful. It's quite ugly and gray and cement.
Hmm.
And then the intuition starts to get blocked because it doesn't want to engage with the environment.
Yeah.
And this results in like a total lack of connection or ability to experience that magic that does exist in nature.
Yeah.
So even when we think about myth, we think, oh, it's so fantastical and seems so magical and almost unconceivable.
Uh,
But I think that's just our how we engage with the environment now. It seems like we are blocked to intuitively understand it that way because there's such a sort of, let's say in the West, just quite a strong spirit possession in that way that we're just seeing things very literally and are forgetting about infusing soul into our external environments as well, that it has such an importance with how we feel and how we even can understand nature.
yeah, we definitely have to grant the environment its due, understand the power that it has over us, and understand that, like, an imbalanced environment, one that is deprived of aesthetics, which is more of a soul-oriented energy,
Hmm.
is going to deprive us, the inhabitants of the environment, of the principles of the unconscious, of soul.
Hmm.
And we have to sort of turn around and confront that.
Hmm.
I think of, like, you have the idea of grass in suburbia. It's this clearing, right? And this is, yeah, mirrored in the whole trend of mindfulness meditation,
Hmm.
which is only one form of meditation, but it's this desiring of a clearing, right? An emptiness,
Yeah.
because the grass gets rid of the vines,
I mean, people don't even want weeds in their lawn.
right? Yeah, it's got to be pristine.
It's like insane. It's like you see people like picking out dandelions. What are you doing?
Yeah, we're sort of scared of the archetypal swamp, where the
Hmm.
alligators and the vines are. You want a space where you can feel safe, right? You want a safe space, which is a form of anesthetization,
Hmm.
right? Recoiling from nightmares. You want to feel safe.
Right, and that needing for safety is like a lack of, internal safety as well.
Right.
Because wanting to manifest it externally in the environment is the fact that we haven't figured out internally what safety really means to us.
Yeah. I I love the idea of, if you go into any foreign place thinking that, you're in a dream. Right, because in a dream, you're invincible, you can't die in a dream. And if you go into places, with that mentality, it will, like, reflect you're creating that safety in yourself.
Right.
Right, you don't go around doing stuff like jumping off of buildings, but, like,
Yeah, that might be a little bit dangerous. I mean, that's that line of how much you are infused with the balance of soul and spirit, right? Have too much of one, then maybe you do
yes.
do ridiculous. things and think you're immortal.
But you're cultivating that inner safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a hyperbolic example, but it's funny.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. And I guess we see that now there isn't such an importance put on sacred spaces.
mhm.
Especially, let's say, in sort of, our generation. There are obviously religious sacred spaces, but it seems like unless you are religious, there aren't really many other spaces that you can go to enjoy its aesthetic value. And even now you see that like even churches are less beautiful than what they were. It's like
Yeah.
even in those institutions themselves, it's, fading. And that could just be purely because people want this thing to be accessible to so many people.
Mhm.
It's utilitarian. It's like forgetting that the aesthetic has its purpose as well.
Yeah, the dearth of sacred spaces is, not only manifested in the environment, but also everything else, because then, the music becomes not sacred
Mm, mhm,
and it's no longer in the culture. So we have to take the music and we have to deem it sacred. We have the power to make the profane sacred.
mm,
By virtue of intention, you can create.
right.
That's really all what sacredness is, right? It's intentionality.
Mm,
With music, we still have pieces like Bach's Mass in B minor, which are sacred, but they're much harder to access. And these things don't have the spirit of the age, right? So it feels kind of out of touch.
mm,
And the spirit of the age is just as important to engage with as the spirit of the depths, which is that force of energy which transcends time, culture, and fashion.
right. Mm,
All right. So, yeah, in essence, the point of outlining these tragic myths is that we get to see the two sides of the coin, so to speak, the polar opposites. We see the result when one imminent aspect of a transcendent energy overshadows the other, right? Becomes imbalanced, pathological.
right. So to avoid the swing of the pendulum from one extreme to the other is not to be caught in the myth,
Yes.
right, which brings suffering, but rather strike a balance
Mhm.
in like a sort of a chemical marriage of the sun and the moon.
Yes. This philosophy is encapsulated by the ancient oracle at Delphi, know thyself, because essentially being caught in the pendulum is engaging in a form of self-deception where you're unable to see the myth which binds you. And self-deception is also like a byproduct of our environment as well as general cognitive adaptability, right? John Vervaeke says like the very processes that make you adaptively intelligent also make you vulnerable to self-destructive, i.e., self-deceptive behavior. So what's needed is a form of self-reflection to see where one is caught in these myths.
Mm, yeah, like one of the most traditional forms of self-reflection, let's say, would be like journaling. It catalyzes that process of reflection because you can write something about what you're feeling and reflect on it, months later and be able to actually see patterns that arise.
Yes, pattern recognition, right? As we were talking about in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the benefit of journaling is we have this difficulty of confirmation bias, which works in tandem with the phenomenon of eyewitness fallibility and false testimony. So we see that relying on memory and only what is immediate at our disposal, both spatially and temporally, causes the conditions for self-deception to set in, where you can remain in the grasp of the myth despite thinking that you're free.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, by writing, you create a reflection of yourself which isn't subject to the fickleness of memory.
Mm-hmm.
So really the process in the RGMS is an extension of this practice of the oracle at Delphi, know thyself. It's about identifying aspects of music or art as either Apollonian or Dionysian.
Right. So about becoming aware of the environment and starting to see the operative myths both in the music we engage with and the in which we make.
Yes, and by doing so, we elucidate the energy making what was once unconscious now conscious. And then we can not only be able to differentiate what's acting in our favor or against us, but also realize through symbolic analysis the content of our being which is playing out in the art.
Mm.
Because within every individual, the great myths play out, almost more so now than in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason these tragedies and drama have become all the more prominent in the individual, well, there's two reasons for which we ought to examine the operative myth in the RGMS itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the myth of the RGMS is the teleological dialectic of unconscious and conscious forces. And again, teleology is the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose they serve rather than of the cause by which they arise. And the dialectic is the thesis which gives rise to its opposite, the antithesis, and then is united or reconciled through a synthesis. So the thesis here is the unconscious. We have ancient man ruled by the unconscious, by the energy of soul. And recall that soul in the Dionysian myth is about the disintegration of the individual into the collective. So, thus, the content of primal man's psyche was largely externalized or relegated to nature or the environment. Right? And remember, this is mythological, not literal. And yeah, in this time, you could think of deed as preceding thought. There was no abstraction before acting. And the influence of nature acted upon man's psyche, and he merely responded. There was no forethought, only afterthought.
Right. So one could still tune oneself to the environment in accordance with those benevolent forces over the negative ones.
Right. So then, and gradually, thought, which is exemplary of conscious energy, converged upon deed until eventually thought began to precede deed. So we have thought before action. And this allowed for more abstract thinking, which in turn allowed for the further development of civilization, because now you can plan much further in advance as thought precedes deed more and more. So this essentially marks the transition into the antithesis of the dialectic, which is the reign of conscious energy, which is still largely persistent today. So throughout this process, the content of psyche becomes more localized in the individual. So, for instance, we have language, which used to be formulated based on the sounds of the environment, right? It's externalized. And then it developed so as to be alphanumeric, or a completely abstract invention of man. The syllable, which does not strive to be mimetic of the environment, is a human invention. And then this allowed for widespread literacy, because before, with ideogrammic language, it was more difficult to read and write. And if you could do so, it was your sole occupation as a scribe. So abstraction functions as a form of separation from empirical reality. It comes with many benefits, but also has many downsides, self-deception being the greatest among them, because self is more difficult to deceive when the contents of psyche are relegated to external forces.
Yeah, the environment provides a mirror to like your cognitive functions.
Yeah, but now that the forces of psyche were becoming more localized within the individual, the environment reflected less. And as we know, the fickle nature of memory made it difficult to reflect authentically. But with the development of the alphanumeric language, journal reflections become possible, or at least more widespread than they were before. So, this psychotechnology, which advances our conscious energy, also provides a heuristic to compensate for what is lost in the transition of energy, right? Essentially, the law of conservation. And the development of the alphanumeric language does not totally relegate the psyche of the man to the individual. This actually becomes more prominent with the introduction of nominalism in philosophy, which occurs much later on. And nominalism essentially denies the existence of universals. So, more or less, social institutions such as family, community, state, through the lens of nominalism, are only inventions of the individual, not absolute truths a priori to the individual. And yeah, previously, there were two types of death of the individual, a material death and a social death. The social death occurred when the individual left the group, whether it be family, community, church, or the state. It was a symbolic death, but essentially no different from a material death, especially because before modern technologies, you often lost all contact with the individual who defected. And this is also why the story of Christ's crucifixion is so tragic. Not only does he suffer a brutal material death, but also a social death via the inscription placed atop the cross, which essentially ostracizes or excommunicates him from the community before his physical death. So, this idea of nominalism, which essentially is a rejection of the independent reality of the collective, can be seen as the ultimate and hegemonic progeny of the conscious energy, or the dialectical antithesis. But nominalism isn't properly philosophically introduced until sometime in the 14th century. So, really, overall, the descent into the dialectical antithesis of conscious energy is a very long and gradual process without very clear cut markers. Even in the 20th century, we have markers of resistance to this nominalist kind of thinking. For instance, in the case of single mothers or parents from early 20th century America, there's this strange phenomena where if the husband, let's say, of a single mother leaves or walks out for the proverbial pack of cigarettes and never returns when the children are quite young, oftentimes the mother will speak of her former husband as though he was dead, and sometimes quite literally and explicitly tell both the children and her family that her husband died, when in fact he may well be alive in some other part of the country. And this is because to the single mother, her former husband really may as well be dead. Thus, the symbolic death of this man defecting from the institution of the family is empirically no different than a material death, which again suggests a resistance to a purely nominalistic approach to reality. However, on the other hand, in the 20th century, we have triumphs, or rather an embracing of nominalism, as depicted in the stories or the myths we create. And the mythological adoption of nominalism is perhaps the zenith of this tradition, wherein the full sway of the dominant conscious energy has been put on display. It is precisely from these mythologizations of nominalism that we inherit the pinnacle of emphasis on the individual in modernity. And a great example is the film Star Wars. It's a hero's journey, and the hero's myth in the past, the hero had to travel a vast distance, right? Evil is localized. It needs to be traveled to, such as like in The Hobbit, you have Bilbo and the dwarves traveling to the lonely mountain where the dragon Smaug resides. But now with Star Wars, the battle of good and evil happens within the psyche. It's intrapsychic. The Sith is the imbalanced or pathological Jedi. In Star Wars, time and space have been conquered. They can go anywhere, anytime they want. The Death Star is the localized force of evil, but the difference is the journey itself to the Death Star is not really a factor, since they can just move into hyperspace and arrive in the blink of an eye. So therefore, this dimension of the hero's journey, journeying to the climactic battle between good and evil, still needs to play out and happens instead on a psychical level rather than on a physical one. So, with the predominant force of evil no longer necessarily localized externally, the hero's journey occurs within the psyche of the hero Luke Skywalker. And it is within that Luke must overcome the anger which runs through his blood and destroyed his father Anakin, who has now become Darth Vader. So, this intrapsychic condensing of time and space is the same phenomena we have occurrent in the age of digital music, right? Time and space become excised. We can access anything at any time.
Mhm.
So, anyway, historically, getting back to the teleology, sometime after nominalism, Shakespeare writes Hamlet, and the tragedy of this play displays on full view the dominance of conscious energy in our culture. And here what we have is Hamlet, having encountered the ghost of his dead father, flits about throughout the play, questioning whether or not he's actually seen the ghost of his father or he's going mad. And that serves as the fundamental core of the play, that uncertainty. And whereas before the age of conscious energy, people would see a ghost and understand it to be a part of the great scheme of things. But now the rationalistic thinking has deemed anything of the underworld to be a spook or simply a symptom of madness. And ostensibly, this catalyzes a great repression of the unconscious in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which we see exemplified by the West historical treatment, really oppression of women, right? Because
Yeah.
women are known for their radical intuition, and intuition being a quality of soul or the unconscious.
Hmm. Yeah, it's quite evident in Puritanism as well, which rejected even those aesthetic things associated with beauty and the soul.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, what happens is this repressed unconscious energy isn't allowed to express itself in a healthy manner. So, it creates an amplitudinal echo chamber of itself, right? It builds up until it bursts out, just like in the myths,
Mm-hmm.
comes out as material suffering, both individually and collectively. Yeah, and since it's spent so long building upon itself, it essentially becomes alchemically, too much of a good thing. And we see this play out with such events as the countercultural revolution, which tries to shed the Puritanism of the past through pure Dionysian hedonism. But again, just like the myth of the Bakke, the energy of the counterculture becomes enveloped by that of soul and near completely detached from the world. And this is evident in parts of the psychedelic culture today.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see in events such as the countercultural revolution, there is this striving to return to the unconscious energies. We have collectively intuited, although not necessarily cognitively so, the dominance of conscious energy in our age, which by virtue of becoming more and more unbalanced, has made its cultural byproducts less desirable. So the teleology of the RGMS is again akin to the hermetic swing of the pendulum, wherein our ancient history begins with the dominance of the unconscious and gradually transitions into that of the conscious. But for Hermeticists, a return is not desirable, but rather an integration or a synthesis. This is because a return would be nothing more than a swing with the pendulum, which traps us in the realm of suffering, where we become caught in the myth, unaware of what assails us. But once we become aware of the swing, we may step outside of it. So now with the dialectic, what we aim to try and achieve is the healthy integration of these repressed forces of the unconscious into our conscious mode of being. Essentially, then, the path of integration or the method of achieving this dialectical synthesis may again bifurcate or split, insofar as archetypally we may opt for a method which makes use of either the energy of more conscious oriented principles to formulate integration or more unconscious valenced energies. And an example in the case of a conscious method is the dream analysis of Sigmund Freud, which assigns static representations to the content of dreams. This kind of method uses the rational left brain conscious energies of the psyche to approach the radically unconscious energy of dreams. And as we said, the reason we may have such vivid nightmares or symbolically rich dreams is because of the repression of the unconscious by the dominance of conscious energy. So, ostensibly, we have a problem created by the imbalance of conscious energy, which, via a method such as Freud's, we are trying to resolve through further conscious driven energies. And as we learned from the tragedy of Oedipus, this will only bring us to further suffering, as the energy of conscious is again also that of Apollo or spirit, yang, and solar principles.
Or a method which makes use of unconscious energy, as seen in some parts of the psychedelic culture.
Right. The psychedelic culture using psychedelics to sort of awaken, going to these sort of hedonistic festivals.
Mm-hmm.
But the psychedelic is, right, you're just allowing the thing to act upon you. It doesn't require any action taken by you, the individual. Inherently a soul oriented method.
Mm-hmm. You're right. And we're saying here, if that was your only method, it may not work very well because.
Right. You would succumb to the tragedy of the unconscious as exhibited in the Bakke.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, really, it's not without difficulty that, now aware of the drama within our psyches, that we try to perform the exercise of integration. Because conditioned by our environment, the act of trying to achieve this, we have a set of expectations which linger. And this is manifested through the shadow that revelatory religion casts upon our collective psyche. Because, in the West, we have a tradition of religions which are revelatory, right? They're monotheistic revelations. The prophets hear the voice of God. So unconsciously, then, we have this desire to be struck with this sudden insight, to understand the symbol, right? To hear the voice of God, rather than experience the organic, gradual unfolding of that symbol, something which is underlying all the pagan cosmologies, right? The pagan cosmologies don't have prophets, so to speak. It's an organic development. So, deeming each of the extremes unfavorable, as highlighted in both of the Greek tragedies discussed, we opt for the path of the middle way, which strives to be at once the progeny of Apollo as well as Dionysus. And this is music as the dialectical synthesis.